a practicing pediatric occupational therapist in Washington State, a select member of the advisory panel of the American Occupational Therapy Association, a visiting clinical assistant professor at the University of Puget Sound, where she teaches in the entry-level master's program and post-professional doctoral program. Working in a multitude of settings, including clinics, schools, and private practices, she has set new standards. A recognized lecturer at state, regional, and national conferences on the topics of sensory processing, sensory-based occupational therapy intervention, and issues related to services for children with autism. She also has many publications to her name. The lead author of the AOTA Practice Guideline for Children and Adolescents with Challenges in Sensory Processing and Sensory Integration, and the co-editor of the prestigious publication, Autism, a Comprehensive Occupational Therapy Approach. Let us give a warm welcome to Renee Watling. She will be talking on using evidence to inform sensory interventions for children with ASD.
Thank you for inviting me to be here this weekend. It's been a lovely experience so far. I do want to just mention that, let's see if I can get my slides started. All right, here we go. The topic that I'm going to be talking about today is a topic that's already been alluded to by the earlier speakers this morning. We're going to be taking a closer look at the sensory needs of people on the autism spectrum, and I'm going to be talking through two different classifications as well as some of the evidence for these strategies to help us really inform evidence-based practice. This slide lists a number of colleagues that have worked with me as we've reviewed the literature and really tried to glean what we can about the current knowledge base in this area. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize this group of individuals. As I mentioned, both Wen and Bill already talked some about the sensory needs that they've experienced as individuals who have autism spectrum disorder. What we know when we look at the literature around sensory issues in autism, we see that sensory features are reported in up to 95% of children who are on the spectrum. This is an increase in earlier ideas around the commonalities of sensory features of individuals on the spectrum, and it's really becoming much more recognized at how common these sensory features are. The most recent edition of the diagnostic manual that's used in the United States for diagnosing autism now includes sensory features as part of the conceptualization of the disorder, and that is now contributing to the diagnostic process. When we look at what exactly the sensory needs are, we know that there's a wide range of sensory needs. So we can't just ask that question, what are the sensory needs in autism, and give one answer to that question. The answer is going to be different for each individual. What we see is that there's a range of needs. Some individuals have what we call hypo-responsive reactions to sensory input, where they seem to not respond to sensations that are occurring around them. So this could take the form of an individual not responding when a sound occurs, or not noticing when somebody brushes against them and bumps into their body. On the other hand, we can have individuals who have the hyper-responsive reactions. And these are the individuals who experience life as too loud, too bright, too fast. The environment around them becomes very overwhelming, and that can often lead to behaviors that interrupt them and interrupt their engagement in daily life activities. We can also see both of those patterns within the same individual. They may have one sensory system that functions really well, another sensory system where they have hypo-responsive reactions, and another system that's hyper-responsive. And then we can also have what we call paradoxical responses, where there's no predictability. The individual may respond with one pattern one time they experience a sensation, but respond with the opposite pattern the next time they experience that exact same sensation. So this is an area that can be, that there's a lot of fluctuation, and it can be very tricky to address this area in treatment. What we do know, though, is that these differences in sensory processing have a wide-ranging impact on individuals. Sensory needs can impact behavior, the ability to engage in self-care or other activities that the individual needs to do throughout the day. It can interrupt learning, social engagement, motor skills, and emotion regulation as well. When we look then at the interventions for these types of issues, there are two classifications that we're going to talk about today. One is what we're calling specific sensory techniques, and the other is being referred to as AIRS sensory integration. And some of you may already be familiar with these terms. Specific sensory techniques are those strategies or techniques that address sensory input in some way. So oftentimes these are strategies that are adding sensory input into the situation, or strategies that might be removing sensory input. So for example, oftentimes in school classrooms in the United States, teachers will ask to have a weighted vest provided for the child. And the weight that is applied to the body through that vest is providing what we call a kinesthetic and a proprioceptive type of input. So we're adding something. We can also have techniques that are blocking or removing input, and so we think about things like noise-canceling headphones, where if we put the headphones on the individual, it's blocking sound. And so these strategies are directly addressing the sensory features in the environment. Those two strategies that I just described have the sensory input as the primary aspect of the intervention that's being addressed. We can also have strategies for intervention where the sensory component is a secondary feature, and that comes through things like massage, where often massage is targeting the energies in the body, but touch is a heavy component of massage, so that sensory aspect of the massage, while it's very, very prevalent and present in that intervention, is actually secondary to the original philosophy of the intervention. Specific sensory techniques can also be implemented individually or in group situations. So oftentimes we'll provide these techniques at the individual level, or we can provide them to groups, which we often have happening again in school-based classrooms. And when they are provided at the individual level, these can be customized to the child. Now, these types of strategies are typically used in order to provide an immediate effect that has a short-term effect. So we're often providing these strategies when we see a client demonstrating signs of some kind of sensory dysregulation that's happening. We also consider these to possibly be adaptive strategies that the individual can adopt into their daily lifestyle and use across time. So it's not intended to necessarily change the way they process sensation and have a lasting effect, but it is intended to provide an immediate effect to get the person through whatever they're currently experiencing. So these are listed for you some of the specific sensory techniques that are relatively common when we look at the literature. Weighted vests, movement, which taps into the vestibular system in the body, what we call embedded sensory motor activities, and this is when we're adding routine sensory motor activities into the individual's day. Using different types of seating devices that allow the person to move while they're still in a seated position. Providing tactile stimuli to the hands, to the feet, or other parts of the body. Looking again at auditory input and either providing that through some of the listening programs or by blocking that type of input. And then also looking at the sensory features of the environment and perhaps doing some modifications to those aspects. The other classification of sensory interventions that I want to talk about today is AIRS sensory integration. And this is a more comprehensive approach where intervention activities incorporate multisensory input. The activities themselves tend to be very playful, and that's a big component of the philosophy of AIRS sensory integration. This intervention also occurs in the context of a relationship. So the intervention isn't just delivered to the child, but there's a relationship that occurs, a transaction that occurs as the therapist and the child work together and participate in the intervention. The child is not a passive recipient of sensation in this strategy, but is actively engaged in each of the activities and actually helps to co-create the activities as they occur. In that way, the AIRS-SI approach customizes the intervention activities to the individual needs of the child. And this method is always delivered in an individual format because it needs to be responsive and customized in that way. Because of that, it is intensive in resources. There's a huge demand on practitioner time, and there's also a need for a frequency and a duration across time in order to provide the changes that are promoted. When we look to the literature around sensory integration, there's been a lot of discrepancy in the way the term has been used across the years. In 2011, there was a paper published that described what we call the fidelity parameters for this intervention, and that fidelity tool lays out all of the different characteristics that need to be present for that sensory intervention to actually be classified as AIRS-SI. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that being available for us. The aims of AIRS-SI are very different from the aims of the specific sensory techniques. This intervention really proposes that by tapping into and really targeting the sensory systems that are problematic for the child, we can begin to start to change some of the underlying neurophysiological processing of sensation itself. So this is really intended to provide a deep type of an input that can produce change in the nervous system that would produce a lasting effect. And that if we can actually do that, we are then creating a better foundation for the individual to learn and thereby build competency and mastery of skills. So keeping in mind then the differences in these two strategies, the sensory techniques really intending to do a short-term immediate effect, and the AIRS-SI really intending to start to change neurophysiology. When we look at ASI, I mentioned before that it is an intensive intervention and there are several required elements. The therapist must be specifically trained. This is not the type of training that happens in entry-level occupational therapy practice. It's a post-professional type of training that requires 2 to 3 weeks of hands-on training. Individualized assessment of each child is also very important, as is adequate space and appropriate equipment in order to provide the sensory experiences that are important. One of the speakers earlier really talked about how important it is that we bring caregivers and family members into the interventions that we're providing to children, and that is a primary part of this intervention. Caregivers are expected to be trained and be engaged in the delivery of this methodology. The types of activities that are provided in sensory integration really prioritize 3 main senses: the tactile system, the vestibular system, and the proprioceptive system. So the activities that you'll see happening in AIRS sensory integration tend to involve a lot of movement, a lot of physical work of the individual's body, and a lot of engagement with different types of textures. The activities themselves also specifically address things like self-regulation, active engagement in the activity, and then physical development of continuously more complex skills across time. Again, that therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist is a priority, and the therapist is really keys in on actively adjusting the activities to meet the child at what we call that just right level of challenge. So we want to work with kids at a level of challenge where they're being pushed forward, but not pushing so hard that it provokes their anxiety or causes them to experience failure. We keep them at what we call that just right level of challenge so that they can be moved forward in a way that's very supportive. And then again, the activities overall promote engagement and support success. We're not doing things for the child or doing things to the child, but we're engaging them actively in the activities and then supporting their ability to become successful in the demands of that activity. So with these 2 different types of methods of addressing the sensory needs of individuals with autism, we want to look at the evidence and look at what does that tell us about what we can expect when we use these different strategies. We'll talk first through some of the evidence for the specific sensory techniques, and then we'll go through some evidence for AIRS-SI. I'm going to start with the weighted vest. Again, this is a relatively common technique that's used in the United States and is very common actually in public school classrooms. When we look across the literature base in this area, we can find many, many studies looking at the utility of weighted vests and the types of outcomes that they can produce. When we look specifically, we see that the studies themselves have varying levels of rigor. Many studies have very small samples, and the methods that were used in those studies is not very high. So that really informs how much weight we can put into the results of the studies. We do see that when we look at the use of weighted vests for children with autism, those studies are telling us that there's not a significant effect on engagement, on self-injury, on stereotypical behaviors, or on problem behaviors. We do see some positive effects from weighted vests when we look at their use with people who have ADHD. So it's possible that for an individual who has autism and ADHD, a weighted vest could produce some positive effects on attention, disruptive behavior, self-injury, or stereotypical behaviors. There are two types of movement that we'll look at. The first is physical activity. And we saw lots of videos of physical activity earlier when we were looking at the activities that are done in the ashram. Exercise programs and what we call embedded movement breaks, or offering students the chance to get up out of their seated desks in the school classroom and move, these things are positively affecting repetitive behaviors, aggression types of behaviors, off-task behaviors, and academic engagement. So the literature is giving us evidence of the outcomes that we're desiring as a result of physical activity. And what we're finding is that vigorous exercise is more effective than less strenuous exercise, and that we can see effects lasting anywhere from 40 to 90 minutes. So as we allow our students to participate more regularly in physical activity and strenuous activity, it's likely that we can see some normalization, perhaps, of some of the aggressive behaviors or off-task behaviors. What's interesting in this area is that in the United States in particular, there has been recent movement in the direction of restricting or limiting children's access to recess. And we're having such a shift in our emphasis in the schools to focus more and more on academic achievement that we're pulling kids away from their opportunities for this kind of movement. And then we're seeing increased problems in the classroom. So this is the type of research that we need to get out to our public officials who are making policy. We can also look at movement that's being provided through equipment. And oftentimes in sensory integration activities, we're putting children on swings or seating them on balls and having them bounce. So we're using different devices to move the body through space. When we do that, immediately prior to some kind of a tabletop academic task, we do see increases in their correct academic responding. We see that same effect when we do rotary movement with children. A lot of schools have tried to take advantage of this by giving kids devices to sit on during classroom work that allow their bodies to move a little bit without being disruptive and needing to create big movements in the classroom. But we are not finding good results from putting air cushions on top of students' chairs or by seating them on therapy balls during their tabletop work. I mentioned earlier that tactile input is a very important part of sensory integration intervention, and when we look specifically at the tactile input that's coming through Gong Massage, we do see some very good effects that are beginning to emerge. This particular type of massage that's been looked at is a parent-delivered intervention where the parents are the ones that are responsible for providing the Qigong massage on a regular basis, working with their children, and we're seeing medium to large effects where this massage is reducing those classic autism behaviors, increasing receptive language abilities of the child, improving the children's self-regulation, and then also reducing parent stress. And I think it's important with this particular intervention to remember that the tactile component is very important, but there's also a relationship component that's happening through that massage. And with the massage being consistently provided by the parent, there's something that's happening perhaps between the parent and the child that is producing a positive effect for each of them. Environmental modification is the last specific technique that we'll look at. And the literature in this area is very thin, but it's also promising. Again, the speakers this morning alluded to the challenges that they often have in environments due to the noise or due to the sound. And what we are seeing is that when sound-absorbing panels are added to school classrooms, we're seeing increased attention spans, decreases in the latency or that delay for students to respond to instructional cues, and we're seeing decreases in stereotypic behavior. When we take those same classrooms that have the sound-absorbing panels and we add halogen lights, taking out the fluorescent lighting and add in halogen lighting, we also see decreases in the non-attending behaviors of our students. And students that are able to self-report are reporting that they have improved emotional responses and improved classroom performance in those environments. So I think this data is telling us that it's really important we pay attention to what's happening in school classrooms and that we are really responsive in meeting student needs by doing those environmental modifications that we are able to do. And adding sound-absorbing panels is a relatively accessible type of intervention that could easily be done in many places. So shifting gears to look at the evidence for AIRS sensory integration. I mentioned earlier about the literature having some challenges with the way this terminology is used. And prior to about 2010, many publications called interventions sensory integration, but those interventions did not actually meet the criteria for what we call AIRS sensory integration. So when we look at that base of literature and we pull out those studies that actually provided the AIRS-SI, we do see some evidence that's supporting improved social interaction, decreased disruptive behaviors, increases in purposeful play, and reductions in hyperreactivity types of behaviors. However, within this group of studies, none of the studies use the exact same outcome measures, so we can't really collapse across those studies and look at the power of the results, but it does suggest that the intervention can have positive effects. When we look at studies that were done more recently using the AIRS-SI intervention, we are finding that the intervention is able to help promote gains in what we're calling individualized performance-based goals. Now, these are goals that have been created for each individual person who's receiving the intervention, and those goals then direct the therapy. So the therapy becomes customized to target those goals while it is still maintaining fidelity to the overall AIRS-SI integration approach. And so we're improving individual performance on those goals, and then we are also seeing decreases in caregiver assistance that's needed throughout the child's day, as well as caregiver stress levels. There's a lower level study that is also showing that AIRS-SI can lead to significant improvements in motor coordination, nonverbal skills, and complex skills of the children receiving that treatment. So altogether, when we look at the pre-2010 and the post-2010 literature, there is a building body of evidence for the AIRS-SI. We're seeing individualized goal attainment, decreases in caregiver needs and demands, decreases in the autism mannerisms, improvements in play skill, motor coordination, nonverbal skills, complex skills, as well as language engagement. So how do we take this evidence and begin to apply it in our everyday practice for individuals with autism? The first thing that I'm going to suggest is not unique to sensory-based interventions, and this is something that we should do anytime we're looking at an intervention. But I'm going to just suggest that you ask the question, why? Why do you think that this particular client that you're working with would benefit from the intervention that you're considering? So in this case, why do I think that this child would benefit from a sensory-based intervention? What is it that I'm seeing in their behavior, in the way they manage themselves, that suggests to me that there's a sensory basis for the problem? When we ask this question, we begin to kind of pull the layers back and start looking at what's happening at that underlying level and asking whether or not there's a sensory issue going on. We need to also ask, why do I think that a sensory-based intervention will lead to the desired outcome? What is the mechanism of change that I believe is the key to producing the desired change in occupational performance? And is that mechanism of change sensory? So we need to be looking at the client themselves and the behaviors, the skills that they're demonstrating, and ask whether it's a sensory-based issue. And then we need to look at the intervention and see if the mechanism of change through which that intervention should be working matches to what those client needs are. So we really need to be individualizing, and this process of asking this question why will really help us to individualize our interventions to our clients. And then we need to consider the evidence. And when I talk about this, I don't just mean that we look at what somebody else who wrote a paper and published that paper, what they say about the evidence, but we need to be able to really dissect that evidence and look at how does it specifically match the needs of my client or my clientele. So when we look at intervention around sensory issues, we need to look at the studies and who were the participants that were in those studies. What were the sensory characteristics of those individuals? Do those sensory characteristics match the sensory characteristics of who I'm working with? Was the intervention in the study that was published, was that individualized? We've got many published studies that are out that have a protocol-based intervention that was delivered. So the intervention was not individualized to the clients. And when that's the case, we can't extrapolate the evidence to have the same outcome then for the individual that we're working with. We need to look at the form and the type of change that was targeted in the study that was published. We need to look at the form and the duration of intervention that was provided in order to produce the change that was reported. And then we need to look at the goodness of fit between the target outcome and the measurement method. Within occupational therapy, we have a lot of different tools for measuring outcomes, but those tools don't always measure at the level of change that we're anticipating to happen in our clients. And when there's a mismatch like that, we might be missing small changes that are occurring in a positive direction, or we might be misjudging the effectiveness of the intervention because we're seeing a change, or we're not seeing a change due to the lack of sensitivity in those measurement tools. So we really need to make sure that the measurement methods are sensitive enough to pick up change. And then, of course, we look at the strength of the methodology of the studies that were done. So being knowledgeable about how to analyze research evidence and how to interpret it is very important. And then finally, as practitioners, it's very important that when you're considering different interventions, that you look at the pragmatics with which you need to function. What are the systems considerations that you have to work under? What are the policies? What are those types of influences that impact the decisions that you can make as a practitioner? What are the contextual considerations? If you have a desire to do the AIRS sensory integration and offer that for your clients, do you have a physical space that is consistent with what's demanded by that type of intervention? Do you have access to the equipment that's needed in order to provide that intervention? So being very pragmatic about what you really can offer your clients and making sure that that's helping to guide and inform your decision making. And then similar with personnel considerations. Is your staff trained? Do you personally have the training to provide that intervention? Sensory interventions are really interesting. When you watch what's happening during a sensory intervention, it often looks like the therapist is playing with the child. They've put a child on the swing and the child's swinging through space, or the child is climbing through a pit of very brightly colored balls. It looks like fun, it looks like play, and that's part of the art of the intervention, but there's a tremendous theory base behind the intervention that the therapist has to be very knowledgeable in order to use the intervention in a way that will actually produce those outcomes that we're seeing evidence for. So if we have practitioners who don't have the knowledge base and don't have the skill in providing the intervention, it's unlikely that we'll see those desired outcomes. So it's very important that we look at those issues around personnel and make sure that we're able to provide the intervention in order to get that outcome that we're looking for. So then what are those keys to evidence-informed implementation? Always begin with evaluation of client sensory processing and integration. Look at tools to measure individual abilities in this area of sensory needs. Customize the intervention to those evaluation results. Take the evaluation results and customize the intervention, adapt it where it's needed, and make sure that you are matching up the types of sensory interventions that you're delivering to the sensory profile of that person. It's also important that you're able to be flexible, that you're able to be adaptable, to think in the moment and be able to make those adjustments in order to match the sensory needs of the client as they change. Sensory interventions can have an immediate effect. Some of them have a long-term effect, and we need to be able to adjust and adapt as we see those client needs change. It's also important to collect data regularly, and any of you that are practitioners have already heard that probably over and over again. But we need to not only collect the data, we need to use the data to inform our decision making. So collect the data, learn how to interpret it, learn how to respond to it in an evidence-informed way, and then use that data to really guide your decision making. And I think it's important that we're really become skilled at doing this at an individual level, and in that way, we can provide that evidence-informed intervention to our clients. So just to summarize, we can improve our evidence-based use of sensory interventions when we have highly knowledgeable and well-trained therapists who are consulting the literature, who are able to think flexibly and individualize their interventions, and then who are also able to measure client performance and use the data then to plan, implement, and make adjustments to their sensory-based interventions. Thank you.